The last person who saw Margaret Halloway alive said she seemed strangely calm. Before we continue, comment below which city you are watching from and what time it is now. I like to know who is on the other side. It was November 23rd, 1897. An ordinary Thursday in the small town of Briarwood in upstate New York. Autumn had already taken hold of the trees. Leaves fell silently onto the dirt roads. The sky was low and dense, as if winter were just waiting for permission to arrive. Margaret was 32 years old. She had brown hair that was always tied back in a low bun. She had light eyes that, according to records, rarely looked directly at anyone. She was described as polite but distant. She worked as a seamstress in the small workshop on Main Street, next to the Whitmore Brothers Pharmacy. She lived alone in a rented house at 47 Elm Street, a two-story wooden building with peeling paint and a single window facing the Methodist Church cemetery. She had no known family in town, no close relatives, no faces that appeared on important dates. Neighbors said she was polite, but never invited anyone in. She paid her rent on time. She caused no trouble. She asked for no favors. She was invisible to the extent that a single, middle-aged woman could be in a small town at the end of the 19th century. But there was something in the records, something small, almost imperceptible. In the local police station's incident book, there is a note made 3 weeks before her disappearance. It is not a formal complaint, just a side note, handwritten by Chief Harold Finch. Woman from Elm Street asked if it was possible to trace a letter that never arrived. She said someone must have sent it. She provided no further details. She seemed nervous. No one paid any attention at the time. Margaret continued her work at the sewing workshop. She woke up early. She walked to the center. She spent the day bent over fabrics and threads. She returned at dusk. She lit the lamp in the living room. She closed the curtains, and she would disappear into the silence of that house that smelled of mold and dried lavender. But on the morning of November 23rd, something changed. She arrived at the workshop 15 minutes late, something unusual for someone so punctual. Mrs. Beatrice Lowell, the owner of the establishment, noted this in her personal diary. She wrote, "Margaret looked tired, dark circles under her eyes. She didn't speak all morning. When I asked if she was okay, she just smiled and said yes. But it was a strange smile, like someone who has already made up their mind." During lunch, Margaret left. She usually ate at the workshop, a piece of bread and jam she brought from home. But that day, she walked to the train station. The ticket office clerk, Mr. Thomas Grimshaw, remembers her. He gave his statement 6 days later, when it was already too late. He said Margaret asked about train times to Albany. She didn't buy a ticket. She just asked. He thought it was strange because she was holding a letter in her hand, a letter without an envelope, folded in half. He couldn't read the contents, but he saw that it was handwritten in black ink, in irregular handwriting. When he asked if she needed help, Margaret smiled again, that same smile that Mrs. Lowell had described. And she said, "No, thank you. I was just confirming something." She returned to the workshop. She worked until late afternoon. She didn't say a word. At 5:30, she packed up her belongings, put her shawl over her shoulders, and walked out the door. Beatrice Lowell saw her turn left toward Elm Street. That was the last time anyone saw Margaret Halloway walking in daylight, because when the sun rose the next day, the door of number 47 was ajar, the lamp was still lit, the kitchen table was set for dinner, and Margaret was gone. But what disturbed everyone, what made Sheriff Finch write in capital letters in the official report, was this. On the table, next to the untouched plate, was a letter, the same one she had been holding at the train station, and on it, written in shaky letters, was just one line. "You were right. I came. To understand what happened that November night, we need to go back a few months, to reconstruct, from the fragments that remain, who Margaret Halloway was before she disappeared." She had arrived in Briarwood in March 1896, alone, with a worn leather suitcase and an envelope containing job references from a town called Cooperstown, about 50 miles away. The references were vague but polite. They said she was reliable, discreet, and skilled with a needle and thread. Mrs. Lowell needed help in the workshop. She hired Margaret without asking too many questions. At that time, it was not unusual for women to move to small towns alone. Widows, women fleeing bad marriages, daughters who had lost their parents. Briarwood was the kind of place that didn't ask many questions, as long as you paid your bills and didn't cause a scandal. Margaret fit the bill perfectly. She rented the house on Elm Street for $3.50 a month. The landlord, Mr. Amos Crandall, noted in his record book that she paid 6 months in advance, in cash. He thought it strange, but he didn't refuse. He said she seemed in a hurry to settle in, as if she were running away from something, but without looking back. The first few months were quiet. Margaret worked. She came home. She was rarely seen outside of those two places. She didn't go to church. She didn't attend afternoon teas. She didn't go to Sunday fairs. Mrs. Lowell once commented that Margaret seemed to live inside herself, as if the outside world were just a backdrop. But there were moments when something escaped. On July 17th, during a summer storm, Margaret arrived at the workshop soaked. Her hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the needle. Mrs. Lowell offered her tea and asked if everything was all right. Margaret was silent for almost a full minute. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "I thought he wouldn't know where I was." Mrs. Lowell asked who. Margaret didn't answer. She just went back to work, her eyes fixed on the fabric, as if she were sewing to forget. Weeks later, in early September, the mailman, Mr. Lewis Bridger, delivered a letter to Margaret. He remembers because the envelope had no return address, only her name written in large, uneven letters, as if the writer had been in a hurry or afraid of being too legible. He delivered the letter to the workshop. Margaret took it, looked at the envelope for a long time, and without opening it, put it inside her apron. That afternoon, she left early. She said she wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Lowell let her go. But a neighbor, Mrs. Edna Colfax, who lived 2 houses down on Elm Street, swore she saw Margaret burning something in the backyard at dusk. Black smoke rising in thin spirals. The smell of burning paper. Margaret didn't mention anything the next day, but something had changed. She began to lock the front door more carefully. Mrs. Colfax noticed that Margaret started checking the street before going in or out. And on some nights, late at night, you could see the lamp on in the second-floor bedroom for hours on end, as if she couldn't sleep. On November 2nd, Margaret did something unusual. She went to the Whitmore Brothers Pharmacy and bought a small bottle of laudanum, a common sedative at the time used for insomnia and nervousness. Mr. Joseph Whitmore noted the sale in the record book. He said Margaret looked extremely pale, almost gray. When he asked if she was ill, she replied, "I just need to sleep." Over the next few days, she continued to work as usual. But Mrs. Lowell noted in her diary that Margaret had begun to mutter to herself while sewing. They were not clear words, just fragments. "He can't. I didn't say that. That's not fair." And then came the letter, the one no one saw arrive. On November 20th, 3 days before the disappearance, the mailman swore he didn't deliver anything to Margaret. But when Mrs. Colfax passed the house on Elm Street that afternoon, she saw Margaret sitting on the porch, holding an open envelope. The paper trembled in her hands. Mrs. Colfax waved. Margaret didn't respond. She just stared down the street, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. 2 days later, Margaret asked about train schedules, and the following night, she disappeared. But there was something no one knew yet. Something that would only be discovered weeks later, when Deputy Finch searched the house for clues. Under Margaret's bed, hidden between the loose floorboards, was a small black leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellowed. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate. And on the last page, written in ink that was still wet, was a single sentence: "If I don't come back, it's because I chose to believe." The night of November 23rd, 1897, fell over Briarwood like a heavy curtain. The wind blew from the north, carrying the smell of dead leaves and damp earth. The streets were deserted. Most of the houses had their lamps extinguished before 8 o'clock. It was a town that went to bed early, a town where the silence of night was not only expected, It was necessary. Margaret Halloway left the sewing shop at 5:30 in the afternoon. Mrs. Lowell saw her leave. She was wearing her usual grey shawl, the same one she wore every day. She carried the small cloth bag where she kept her house key and a few coins. Nothing else. Years later, Mrs. Lowell described how Margaret paused at the door before leaving, just for a moment, as if she were gathering her courage for something. Then she turned her face, waved slightly, and walked down Main Street toward Elm Street. It was 6 blocks, a 10-minute walk. Mr. Albert Renwick, the grocery store owner, was closing up when he saw her pass by. He said Margaret was walking slowly, slower than usual, looking around as if she expected to see someone. He thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. He locked the door and went home. Margaret continued on. At the corner of Main Street and Elm Street, she passed 16-year-old Daniel Hurst, who was returning from the sawmill where he worked. He later gave a statement. He said Margaret nodded to him, but did not smile. Her eyes were fixed on some point ahead. He went on his way. She went on hers. At 6:15 p.m., Mrs. Edna Colfax, who lived at 39 Elm Street, heard Margaret's door close. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The sound was clear. The wooden door creaked slightly. Then the lock clicked. Everything was normal. But then something unusual happened. At 6:40, Mrs. Colfax heard the door open again. She looked out the kitchen window. She saw Margaret standing on the porch, looking down the street. She wasn't wearing her shawl, just her simple work dress. The wind ruffled her loose hair, something no one had ever seen before. Margaret always wore her hair up. Mrs. Colfax thought it was strange. She thought about asking if everything was okay. But before she could do anything, Margaret walked down the 3 steps from the porch and started walking, not toward downtown, not toward the church, toward the cemetery. Mrs. Colfax watched. Margaret crossed the street and followed the narrow path that led to the gates of the Methodist cemetery. The sky was already dark. There was no moon, only the dim light from the few windows still lit in the nearby houses. And then Margaret disappeared among the trees. Mrs. Colfax waited. She looked out the window for a few more minutes. But Margaret did not return. She thought about going after her. But it was night, and cemeteries, even in small towns, were not places where women walked alone after dark. So she went back to the kitchen, finished making dinner, and decided that if it was important, someone would know about it the next day. But the next day brought only silence. At 7 o'clock on the morning of November 24th, Mr. Amos Crandall, the owner of Margaret's house, passed by Elm Street on his way to the bank. He noticed that the door of number 47 was ajar, just a few inches. The wind made the wood creak slightly. He knocked. No one answered. He pushed the door open. He went inside. The room was untouched. The lamp on the table was still lit, but the oil had run out during the night. The flame had gone out a few hours ago. The kitchen table was set. 1 plate, 1 glass, 1 fork, and 1 knife, as if Margaret had prepared dinner but never sat down to eat. On the table next to the plate was the letter. Mr. Crandall picked it up. He read it. He didn't understand. "You were right. I came." He went upstairs. The bedroom was empty. The bed was made. The clothes were hanging in the closet. Everything was in its place. Nothing was missing, except Margaret. He went downstairs, locked the door, and went straight to the police station. Deputy Harold Finch arrived at the house at 9 in the morning. He searched everything, every room, every drawer, every corner. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no broken doors, nothing stolen, nothing out of place, except Margaret and the letter. Finch questioned the neighbors. Mrs. Colfax told him about Margaret walking toward the cemetery. Finch gathered 3 men and went there. They searched among the gravestones. They walked among the trees. They searched for hours. They found nothing. No trace, no footprints, no pieces of fabric caught on branches, no sign that anyone had been there. But then, in the far corner of the cemetery, near the stone wall that separated the sacred ground from the forest, one of the men found something. On the ground, among the dry leaves, was a small piece of paper, folded, yellowed. It looked like it had been torn from a notebook. Finch picked it up. He opened it. It was written in the same uneven handwriting as the letter left on the table. "Forgive me. I needed to know if it was real." And underneath, almost imperceptible, scribbled hastily, as if it had been written at the last second before something happened, "He's here." The news of Margaret Halloway's disappearance spread through Briarwood like wildfire. In small towns, someone's disappearance isn't just an event, it's an open wound. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows who left and who didn't come back. And when there's no body, no answer, imagination fills the void. Sheriff Finch organized searches. For 3 days, groups of men combed the woods around the cemetery, the nearby fields, the banks of the creek that ran through town. They called Margaret's name until they were hoarse, but the woods yielded nothing, only the echo of their own voices. The women of the town began to whisper. Mrs. Lowell said Margaret had always been strange. Mrs. Colfax commented that single women always attract trouble. Others talked about the letter, about the words that made no sense. "You were right, I came." Who had written it? Where could Margaret have gone? And most disturbing, he is here. Who was he? Finch returned to the house on Elm Street. He searched everything again. That's when he found the notebook hidden under the floorboards. He read it alone, locked in his office at the police station, while the oil lamp flickered on the table. The notebook contained dozens of pages, dated notes, fragments of thoughts. Some pages were legible, others were almost illegible, as if they had been written in haste or despair. The first entry was from April 1896, shortly after Margaret arrived in Briarwood. "He doesn't know where I am. Here I can start over, here I can forget. May. I dreamed about him again. Always the same dream. He is standing at the end of a long corridor. He calls my name, but when I wake up I can't remember his voice. June. I asked the priest if it is possible to love someone who never existed. He didn't understand the question. July. The handwriting began to change. It became tighter, more nervous. The letter arrived. I don't know how he found my address. I don't know how he knows my real name. I burned everything, but I can still smell the ink. August. He says he needs to see me. He says he has something to tell me, something that can't be written, something that can only be said in person. But how can I trust that? How can I trust him? September. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe he never existed. But if he never existed, then who wrote the letters? Who knows things that no one else knows? October. He set up a meeting. He said he would come to Briarwood. He said he would wait for me. I don't want to go, but I need to know. And then, the last entry, dated November 23rd. If I don't come back, it's because I chose to believe. Finch closed the notebook. He took a deep breath. He tried to make sense of what he had read, but every word only raised more questions. Who was this man? Why did Margaret fear him and at the same time seem desperate to meet him? And why had she gone to the cemetery that night? Finch questioned the mailman, Louis Bridger. He asked if he remembered any other letters delivered to Margaret. Bridger said yes. 3 in total. All without a return address. All with the same irregular handwriting. He hadn't kept the envelopes. There was no way to trace them. Then something unexpected happened. On December 1st, a week after the disappearance, a man arrived in Briarwood. He got off the afternoon train. He was tall, thin, wore a worn black overcoat, and carried a small leather suitcase. He was around 40 years old. Dark hair, beginning to turn grey at the temples. Deep-set eyes, pale skin. He went straight to the police station. He asked for Chief Finch. He said his name was Thomas Shepherd, and that he needed to talk about Margaret Halloway. Finch took him to the interrogation room. He closed the door. He turned on the lamp. Thomas Shepherd sat down slowly. His hands were shaking. He took a yellowed envelope from the inside pocket of his overcoat. He placed it on the table. Finch picked it up. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was Margaret, younger, maybe 10 years younger. She was standing next to a man. His face had been torn from the photograph. Only the outline remained. Shepherd looked at Finch. His voice was low, tired. She wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She said she couldn't run anymore. She said she needed to know if I was real. I said I would come. I said I would wait for her. Finch asked where. Shepherd lowered his eyes. At the cemetery. On the 23rd, at 7 o'clock in the evening. That's what we agreed. Finch felt his blood run cold. And did you go? Shepherd nodded slowly. I went. I waited for 2 hours. She never showed up. Finch took a deep breath. Then he asked the only thing that mattered. Who are you? Who are you to her? Shepherd was silent for a long time. Then finally he replied, I'm the reason she ran away. And before Finch could ask any more questions, Shepherd stood up. He took the photograph back. He looked at it as if he were looking at a ghost. But if she went to the cemetery that night, then she wasn't running away from me, she was coming to meet me. He looked up at Finch. And if she didn't come back, it's because someone stopped her. The Margaret Halloway case was never solved. Thomas Shepherd remained in Briarwood for 3 days. He was questioned repeatedly. He told his story in fragments, like someone trying to piece together a broken mirror. He and Margaret had met years earlier in Cooperstown. They were close, maybe more than that. But something happened. He never said exactly what. And Margaret ran away. She changed her name. She disappeared. He spent years looking for her. He hired investigators. He followed false leads. Until finally he found her trail. He sent letters. She burned them. He persisted. And in the end, she agreed to see him. But when Shepherd arrived at the cemetery that night on November 23rd, Margaret wasn't there. He waited until almost midnight. The wind blew between the gravestones. It was pitch black. He called her name. No answer. So he left, thinking she had changed her mind. Finch asked why he hadn't sought help immediately. Shepherd simply said, because I thought she had chosen not to see me. I didn't know she had disappeared. During questioning, Shepherd showed the letters Margaret had sent him. They were brief, shaky, full of fear and hesitation. In the last one, dated November 19th, she wrote, I need to know if what I feel is real or just the memory of something that never existed. Meet me where the dead rest. Maybe there I can finally understand. Finch searched the cemetery again. This time, more carefully. He looked for disturbed earth, for signs of a recent burial, for anything that might indicate violence. He found nothing, but he did find something strange. On the stone wall at the back of the cemetery, there were nail marks, thin, desperate, as if someone had tried to climb the wall in a hurry. And on the other side, in the forest, there were footprints, small ones, a woman's. They continued for about 50 meters before disappearing completely into a patch of dry leaves and moss. Finch followed the footprints as far as he could, but the forest swallowed them up, as if Margaret had simply evaporated into thin air. Shepherd was released. There was no evidence against him. There was no body. There was no crime. Only absence. He left Briarwood on December 4th. Before leaving, he left his address at the police station. He said that if Margaret returned, if anyone knew anything, he wanted to be informed. No one ever contacted him. Years passed. The house at 47 Elm Street stood empty for months. Eventually it was rented to someone else, then to another, and another. No one stayed long. They said there was something wrong with the house, that it was too cold, that the sounds at night were disturbing, but nothing supernatural. Just the weight of silence from something that was never explained. Mrs. Lowell closed her sewing shop in 1902. She moved to Albany. Before leaving, she handed Finch a small box. Inside were Margaret's belongings that were still in the shop. A silver thimble, a piece of blue ribbon, and a needle stuck in a scrap of white cloth. Keep these, she said, in case someone comes looking for her. No one did. In 1912, Sheriff Harold Finch retired. Before leaving office, he officially filed the case as unsolved disappearance. But in the final report, he added a personal note, a remark that should never have been in an official document, but he couldn't help writing it. I revisited the cemetery dozens of times over the years, always at night, always alone. And on each of those nights, I had the strange feeling that Margaret Halloway hadn't left. She had just found what she was looking for, and whatever it was, it didn't belong in this world. In 1923, the town of Briarwood was partially destroyed by fire. The Methodist cemetery survived. But many of the old records, including the original statements and Margaret's notebook, were lost in the flames. Today, more than a century later, Almost no one remembers Margaret Holloway. The house on Elm Street was demolished in the 1960s. The cemetery still exists, but it is abandoned. The gravestones are covered with moss. Trees have grown up around them, hiding the names of the dead. But if you walk there to the far corner where the stone wall meets the forest, you can still see the marks. Faint, almost erased by time, but still there. Nail marks on the stone, as if someone had tried to get out, or as if someone had tried to get in. And if you stand in silence, if you let the wind pass through the trees, if you close your eyes for just a moment, you might hear what Mrs. Colfax swore she heard that November night when she looked out the window one last time before going to sleep. A voice, low, distant, calling a name, Margaret. And then, nothing. Just the silence of an answer that never came. Or maybe it did, and we just weren't listening.